Hi, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Camille Mir, and I'm on the events team at the bookstore, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming Nandana Dev Sen to present her new translation of the Bengali poet and her mother, Nabaneeta Dev Sen's collection, Acrobat, and she'll be in conversation with David Ouimet, the author and children's book writer. Virtual programs like the one you're about to see right now carried us through the heart of the pandemic and continue to be bright spots in our days. So, as we gradually attempt to recover and return to normal. So I want to give a huge thanks to Nandana and David for joining us this evening. Just a quick housekeeping note, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they can't see or hear you. So if you have a question, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the Q&A button. And you can submit your questions into that Q&A throughout the event. And near the end of the event, our panelists will try to get through as many of the questions as possible. There's also a chat button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you won't be able to post anything, but I'll be posting links to the book to Acrobat for you to purchase from Community Bookstore, as well as some children's books from David and Nandana. So please keep an eye out for that throughout the event. And just a general caveat for tonight's event, as with all of our virtual events, we're at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads. So please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll of course try to solve it as quickly as possible. And we'll be continuing our virtual series throughout the summer and the early fall. So make sure to head over to our website, and best way to stay up to date on all of those is to sign up for our newsletter. One that I want to point out is that this coming Monday on July 19th at 7 p.m., we're really excited to have Adam Serwer present his newest book, The Cruelty is the Point, Essays on Trump's America, in conversation with Ibram Kendi. Tickets for that event are available for purchase now, so you can check that out on our website and register for that as well. So just a little bit of background about our panelists, and then we will get started. Nandana Dev Sen is a writer, actor, and a child's rights activist. She's authored 6 children's books and starred in 20 feature films. As an ambassador, Nandana has worked with RAHI, Operation Smile, UNICEF, and Apneap International to fight against child abuse. Nandana has served on the jury of numerous child protection committees, international film festivals, and literary awards, including the DSC Prize for Literature in 2019. After studying literature at Harvard and filmmaking at USC, Nandana has worked as a book editor, a screenwriter, and a translator. David Ouimet is the author and illustrator of the award-winning children's book, I Go Quiet, and the forthcoming companion, I Get Loud. I Go Quiet was the winner of the 2020 East Sussex Children's Book Award and has been shortlisted for the 2021 Kate Greenaway Medal. An artist and a musician, Ouimet is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, and his work has been featured on album covers, books, and magazines, and has been exhibited at the Museum of American Illustration. He scored music for film, recorded and appeared on numerous records, and performed throughout the world. And I misspoke earlier, I Get Loud is out actually right now, and I'll be posting the link to that shortly after the event has started. And now, right before we start, I'm going to share a beautiful montage that Nandana prepared, which has some photographs of the late Nabaneeta Dev Sen. We want to make sure that her presence is, vibrant and present during this event. So please enjoy these beautiful photographs, and then our panelists will take the stage. Just one moment.
Oh, so you're being seen now.
Sorry about that. All right, there we go.
Well, thank you for that beautiful introduction.
Yes, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Camille. And all our thanks to the community bookstore and the wonderful team at Archipelago Books for organizing this. David, my friend,
Yes.
many congratulations for this absolutely stunning book, which
Thank
is
you.
such a treasure
Thank
for me
you.
to have. And I can't tell you how touched I am that you have found the time to do this with me in the middle of a release. This book came out, what, just a week ago?
It did, yes. Well, I've got a lot of show and tell as well. And this is a book that's very, very close to my heart for so many reasons. I just returned from the UK for about a month, and I carried this with me everywhere I was. It's got a cracked spine, it's dog-eared, it's got coffee stains, probably some wine stains, a well-worn friend. And I think that that is what this book will become for so many people. Gloria Steinman wrote a beautiful, beautiful quote on the back of the book, and I'd like to share that. It is a special gift when a great poet of the world is finally well translated. Here, the legendary Bengali poet Nabaneeta Dev Sen is rebirthed in English by her daughter, Nandana Dev Sen. I believe that Acrobat is a book that will rescue us and be loved around the world. And I just think that's such a beautiful tribute to this wonderful, wonderful book. For me, this book really speaks about shedding parts of our past, and in doing so, shedding the story that we create for ourselves in the present. Throughout the book, there are themes of loss, of family, of love and yearning. And there's a beautiful, beautiful sense of motion in this collection, which Nandana and I have spoken about. And I believe it's due to its brilliant construction and the sequencing, which I think is so incredible. So with that, I would like to introduce Nandana Dev Sen, the incredible author, actor, activist, translator, and dear friend, Nandana.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here with you. It's very, very special moment.
It is special. So I mentioned the movement that propels this book. So I think it's fitting to start with a book that really deals with motion. So Nandana, will you share Acrobat with us?
I'd love to. I'm thinking I'm going to, since it's a short poem, I will read it in Bangla first so that everyone has a sense of the music of the original, and then English. Yeah?
Perfect.
মাদারি ভেবেছে সে বুঝি খুব সুন্দর মাদারি খেলা জানে দুহাতে সময়কে নিয়ে লুফোলুফি এখন তখন দুটোই নাচাবে দুমুঠোতে হেঁটে যাবে দড়ির ওপরে ভেবেছে সে সব কিছু পারে জীবনে একবারই শুধু দড়ি কেঁপে ওঠে Acrobat. She thought she knew acrobatics rather well, that she could juggle time with both hands, play with the now right next to the then. She would make both dance, she thought, fist to fist, and she would glide so smooth along the tightrope. She thought she could do absolutely anything at all. Only once in your life will the rope shiver.
It's beautiful. I think that this is actually a perfect opener to the collection because it's very much dealing with balance or being off balance, which is something that runs through many of these poems. There are also poems that keep us off, that catch us off guard. A lot of them do, and I think that sense of balance is something that I sense in a lot of the poems.
That's a observation, yeah.
Would you share the story of this piece? And particularly, I'd like to know about the decision to title the entire collection Acrobat.
Yes, that's It's a very lovely story, actually, and a story in two parts, in fact, because so what happened is that this poem I translated, as you might have seen, I was reading it from not from Acrobat, but from another book called Make Up Your Mind. And this is a book that I translated and published in secret as a birthday surprise for my mom when she turned 75. So what that meant was that I couldn't consult with her on the translations. I had to make the choices myself. And when I read the poem, I interpreted it as a feminist poem about the multitasking that every woman has to do to survive. And therefore, I made the choice of translating the third person pronoun, which is not gendered in Bengali, as a she, as opposed to a he. But that had been one of the questions that I had been concerned with. So when it was no longer a surprise, I asked my mother, "So, Ma, did you write this poem about? Is it a feminist poem? Is it about the balancing act that every woman has to perfect?" And she said, "I love that interpretation, but actually, I wrote it about poetry, about the process of being a poet, about the fact that one word too many or too heavy or too long can throw the poem off balance, can throw it totally off the rope." So it was about the precision of an artist, the precision of a poet that she was writing. But but she loved the way I had interpreted it, and she felt that was also true to the poem, although that was not the thought that she had when she wrote it. So when we were discussing the title, and we signed the contract for this book exactly 2 weeks before my mother died, she was very excited about this book. It was the first book of hers that came out for an international audience. And so we did spend quite a bit of time thinking about the title, and both of us loved Acrobat because we felt that actually the title was true to both interpretations of being an acrobat. This book was both about the delicate balance that you have to constantly negotiate as a woman, and the balancing act of being a poet and an artist, so that it was true to this particular collection. And that's why we chose that. And I have to say that our fabulous publisher, Jill Schoolman, also thought that it was the perfect title. That's how it happened.
That's beautiful. I really think that something you touched on, and which is the ability for every reader of poetry to bring their own emotional selves within it and take away that. And even as her daughter, that you saw that poem as something that was very, very different what she intended. And I think there is that kind of beautiful organic quality of poetry. And particularly with these poems in this collection, I think they're very, very open to, because they're so visceral, and some of them are so raw that it's impossible not to have some reflection to our own experiences as readers. Would you share umbilical cord with us, please?
Yes, that is a poem that I have gone back to so many times. Umbilical cord for my mother. Just to clarify, this is a literal translation of the words in Bengali. My mother wrote it for my grandmother. You are in so much pain. You're trying to cut the birth knot, but Earth's umbilical cord keeps you tied in twists, tangled like our weak and fearful love. You're trying hard to be born into a different, fearless world, but our restless arms, unshakable, like the sacred thread, coil around your neck, a blood-drenched umbilical cord. You will not have the power to leave the womb of this earth and escape freely into a newborn breeze. you will be bound here in pain.
Incredibly powerful. I think one of the more beautiful aspects of Acrobat, as I mentioned, is its construction, because there is such a mindfulness in the way you've sequenced it. And it was actually one of the first things I think that I expressed to you about the book after I had read it. It really affected me, and I think probably that was speaking to my musician side of interpretation, but it does really feel like a musical. It has a lot of musicality throughout the book, but I think the construction and the sequence was key to that feeling. And it's amazing that there is that continuity in the book, because the poems span from the 1950s through every decade, all the way to 2019 when your ma passed. So it's just so remarkable that there is that sense of continuity when these have been written for a period of almost 60 years. And a great example of that sequencing is the poem that follows umbilical cord, which is, umbilical cord is a very, very painful poem. And the poem that follows that is Locked. And that poem is really about a way out. It begs the question, who will unlock the door? And I think, again, that is this beauty that the book holds, is in order to move from one poem with so much anxiety and pain, and then to come to another place, and then you're able to let the light in for the reader. And I just I think readers are going to really respond to how you wove these poems into the 5 movements that the poems are collected in.
I'm so grateful that you noticed that Locked comes after that, because the poem before is about not letting go, and the next poem is about how do you let go, and how.
When was Locke composed as opposed to umbilical cord?
That was actually part of her last. Well, this was still. It was her last book of poetry, but that was still published many years ago, called Make Up Your Mind. To me, honestly, borrowed this little gorgeous book.
I did want to get back to Make Up Your Mind in a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about the choices and the wrestling that you had to deal with and in the sequencing and the construction?
Yes, it was, there were certain themes that were so powerful in the book that for a while I thought, should we arrange it by those themes, like motherhood, daughterhood, language, and poetry, loss, love, betrayal, aging, bereavement, death, all of these things, and the creative process, a lot of poetry on that. But then I thought that would be too prescriptive and too literal a way, because the way she wrote was very, very fluid, and she deliberately wrote in a way, and that was one of the challenges of translating her.
Mm.
She often wrote in language that it was always stunningly beautiful, but frequently ambiguous. So you need to either translate it into ambiguity again, which I did whenever I could, or make some choices, right? So, but this is the way she wrote in a musical way, and I wanted it. I mean, I'm so happy to hear you use that word, because that's what I wanted it to have more of a lyrical build-up of emotion, rather than a literal or linear
Right.
or kind of too prescribed a way to feel. I didn't want the order to indicate how you would feel. I wanted them to kind of come together, rise together to make you feel in a natural, a kind of more, what should I say, more organic ebb and flow of emotion. And I didn't feel we could do that if we had sort of chapter headings that were specific themes. And Jill, my to my publisher. She helped me a lot with thinking about how to do this. And we were totally on the same page about it. So what I ended up doing is taking lines or phrases from her poems and using and kind of centering the cluster of each poem around those words, and there's some consistency to it. So each section has a line or a phrase that appears in a poem that's in that section. It's not as literal as it being a title or anything like that. So we connect that line to the entire segment that line of poetry is embedded in and that poem belongs to. And there were, and I think and then after that, we spent a lot of time thinking of how you build the ebb and flow, as I said.
Well, I think those, I don't know if I think of them as movements, but I think they almost act as leitmotifs. I mean, they really,
Yes.
just adding to the musicality that's innate in her poetry. Another thing that I'm thinking more about the process that you went through, and I know it was a difficult book for you to translate and to work on. And there is in all of her poems this visceral proximity. I mean, you are always close to her pain, her love, her longing, and it's that is something that again runs through very, very deeply in the poems. When you were doing the translations, were you able to step back and breathe a little air by thinking about that overarching idea of how the book would be constructed, or was that done after you had finished the translations?
You mean in terms of the structure of it, of the well, there are a couple of things here. One is that overwhelming closeness and proximity is I had to recalibrate that, because I had grown up with all of this poetry, knowing it really well, loving it, but taking it for granted because it was in my life, that was around me. I knew them, I could recite them, and I loved them. I was sort of
Right.
I had my favorites. But it's almost like when you know something so by heart that you don't think about what each word means, because you accept it and you love it and you celebrate it, so you don't even feel guilty about it.
Here it comes back to proximity. It's just it's too close in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So I think I needed to learn to take a step back and read it in a new way, not different way, because obviously the experience of having read it and having loved it becomes a part of the experience of your reading it again. So, but looking at it as a text that as much as I could, I wanted to look at each text as a text I was looking at for the first time. And so that definitely affected some of, but the proximity made it difficult. Like sometimes there were two poems that were in my mind very, very connected. And on the page, they didn't seem so connected. Like they were connected, but they were not necessarily flowing in this musical way into a crescendo like I would like them to.
Right.
Happening in my head because of my memories, but not necessarily happening on the page. So there were all of those, those discoveries to navigate, and then constant recalibrations of translating as a translator, translating as a daughter, translating as a daughter who's translating while she is mourning the mother. I mean, there were a lot
Just
of
so many layers. Yeah.
layers, exactly. So it was not, that was not easy.
But what an opportunity to reassess something that you could recite in language that was so familiar, for you to really kind of flip it on its head and resculpt it and rethink it and respond to what this language, how it could change. And because you've changed, we've all changed.
Yes.
Speaking of language, I would love to hear Alphabet Bird, one of my favorite poems. And
Yes, I love that. That's one of my favorites too. One of her favorites as well. And actually one of her later poems. alphabet bird. When night falls, I search for him. I bring him home. I look him in the eye, and I cage language. When day breaks, once again the world wraps around my eyes, and off he flies, taking each word, that alphabet bird.
Incredible. So in the beautiful intro to Alphabet, you describe the goal of creating a collection that didn't feel like it was translated. And despite Bengali being a very, very difficult language to translate because it is so concise as a language, it feels incredibly, incredibly organic. And your mother had written, every word matters, every punctuation matters. It is a question of life and death. So you seem to have really honored that responsibility and that ideal that she had for language. I mean, in doing that, you were able to actually add your own language and your own lines. Specifically in Alphabet Bird, you had added a beautiful, beautiful line. Can you explain a little bit? Because what you added, I feel that I'm taking the liberty of assuming that you knew that you had to add that to get to the essence of the poem. And I would love to understand your process in doing that.
Yes, so this one was, again, a poem from Make Up Your Mind. So it meant that it was being published, being translated and published on the sly, since it was going to be this big birthday surprise for my mom. So I translated it very meticulously, very carefully, being extremely true to each word and each line, and there's a rhyming structure in it as well, all of that. And I read it, and I felt it just did not convey the full, you know what, I should probably, well, I won't go into the details, but you know how there's a sense of helplessness in the poem, this
Absolutely.
of a loss of control over that thing that can actually free you, but that thing, rather than freeing you, flies away and you remain in the prison, you remain in the cage. That's sort of what I felt the poem was about, because it was not about not being able to control language. So while understanding that therein lay the road to your being free, to you being able to fly away. So that all of that is beautifully expressed in very little words in Bangla. As you said, it's a very concise language. So what you can say in 5 words can easily take you 5 lines, or sometimes 5 paragraphs in English. So I didn't think it did justice to the poem. At that point, I said, okay, well, I know what this poem is about, and this is the basic metaphor, and so I'm going to adapt it. If my mother were writing this poem in English, how would she write it? And this is a question that I asked myself many times as I did Acrobat when my mother was gone. So I ended up adding several lines. I added the line, I cage language, which isn't there. I added the
Beautiful, beautiful phrase. Yeah.
I added the line, taking away each word, taking each word. And there were other little things there. I also, because it then became a longer poem than the original, I varied the rhyming structure so that it would feel very organic to the new form of the poem and the content as well. So it ended up being an adaptation. It didn't really end up being a translation per se, but my mother, so once the surprise was over and I had given her the book, I showed her the other translation that I had made, which was arguably had more fidelity. And she said, no, absolutely not. This is the one that this is great. This is perfect. And in fact, she liked, which I don't agree with, but she thought that the translation was actually she liked it even more than the original, which is one of the sweet things that mothers say.
That's beautiful.
And feel
Yeah.
better.
I would take that compliment.
So, but what that happened, I'm grateful for that moment, because when I was translating all of this poetry without her, it emboldened me to make choices, to take risks, to adapt rather than literally translate, to really go to the core of each poem and figure out a way that would have been her language of conveying that emotion or that moment or that memory in English. So I felt I'd gotten her endorsement to do that.
Can I ask you, when she was doing her many translations of women poets, did she also go down that same road of
That is an excellent question to ask. I'm so glad you asked me that, because she very much did that. She was dedicated to translating women poets from all over the world. This was a real, not just a passion, it was a kind of, it was a mission that she had, because she believed that poetry was a vital necessity for women, and that poetry, being able to use language to express who you are, to express your identity, was the only assured way of being free. And she didn't just mean poems written in the cities. She was talking about work songs. She was talking about folk songs. She was talking about the ballads from the epics that village women sing in India. She studied all of them academically as well. So it was not a sort of idealistic kind of, it was some work that she actually did a lot of extensive academic research on. So because she was really propelled by this idea that poetry was an essential tool for women's freedom, she made it a priority for her to translate. And she often did this. So one of the, and this is one of the bodies of work that she produced in her last year and a half, she I can't say translated, she transcreated this extraordinary text by a 14th century mystic poet called Lal Ded, who was almost a kind of spiritual leader, but also certainly one of our literary foremothers. And my mother, and she had this book of very short poems, which were mystical, spiritual, and philosophical, self-questioning in a kind of very deep way. And Ma so what she did, I can't even say translated them, because she didn't translate them. What she did was she took a kernel of each poem, and then she wrote her own Bengali poem about it. Of course, crediting Lal Ded's poetry, and she put the number, she made it very easy for people to compare. So she put the number of the poem. All these poems were not titled, they were numbered, like the sonnets. So she kept the numbers, but she made each poem absolutely her own. Like, you wouldn't, if you read Alphabet Bird, and you'd known my mother's original, which is called, of course, just called Alphabet, actually, you would know that this is a kind of, it's an adaptation of that, but you would recognize it as a poem that came out of that poem, right? But my mother's transcreations of Lal Ded's work, you wouldn't, because there's a thought that she picks from each and then spins her own beautiful and very Bengali poetry from it. And she understood she really embraced the idea of literary adaptations and taking.
Well, there are actually there are two poems that are based on the poetry of Lal Ded in the collection. Would you like to share those with us?
I'd love to. I've never read them out aloud before. Actually, I really love them. So this is a great opportunity. So this is called Taste, a Diptych. Based on the Kashmiri poetry of Lal Ded, the 14th century mystic. Craving. It could be bitter or sweet, poison or honey, but it won't be a waste. What is your craving? You will recover that taste if you keep braving this journey until the end of the street. Second one is called crushed. I put all of my heart in a mortar and pestle, crush it into parts, and then chew it well. I keep a cool head, but I cannot tell, am I living or dead?
Her work, not only her scholarly work, but her reimagining the epic poems and from a feminist perspective were absolutely groundbreaking. And she clearly saw this imperative value in her own work, and the way that she could carry on that for hopefully for generations for writers and writers and poets and readers. And I just wanted to share something from the introduction, which is absolutely beautiful, about freedom that poetry delivers. I speak for poetry as being central to a woman's freedom. Yes, I'm partial. I cannot be and do not wish to be objective in this one respect. It is not only the printed word that spells inner freedom for us women. There are oral songs composed by village women. They sing their own sorrows and anguish. Poetry is a means of our survival. It is a window through which we can breathe. It's extraordinary.
It is. It's such a beautiful and clear representation of her faith in poetry, and you read that. That's a beautiful excerpt. I'm so glad that you shared that.
And I think that so much the way you shape this collection in that introduction is you really the reader can really understand how she saw poetry is absolutely vital. I mean, it was her life and blood, and that really comes through. And to understand that and then to experience the poems is a really full experience.
Thank you. I hope, I mean, she called poetry her her magic talisman. She called it that kind of, I mean, what my daughter would, because now we're all in this realm of superpowers, she would call it a superpower. But that she felt that without poetry in her life, she would have disintegrated, and that it was poetry that helped her survive, helped her build an identity, helped her have a voice that was not just literary, but also quite strongly political. But she did all of that through her poetry. So she felt, and she started writing, well, her first book was published when she was 21. Her first poetry was published when she was 7, bilingually, by the way, in English and in Bengali. She was so precocious. But she kept writing until the last few days of her life. She had this notebook.
Incredible.
She kept under her bed, and she always, and this was, so it really was more, it was more than a passion. It was a compulsion for her, poetry, and also a life partner that she could always rely on.
Beautiful.
Yes.
So one discovery that I just made last week was seeing a painting that I've seen many times in the wall of your home, and discovering that she was also an incredible painter and a sculptor as well. And just to understand her incredible creative output in the way that there's so much depth to her painting as well. When did she stop making visual art?
She never fully stopped, but when we were very young and living in America, she did much more of it. She was always, so this is from her early, from just before she came back to India. I don't know if I can actually, I probably shouldn't move this, but
right.
let you know.
Can attest it's absolutely beautiful.
I can try to move it, maybe there.
Yeah.
You can see it a little bit.
Yeah.
There are 3 girls trapped in 3 bottles, and those are us. So she stopped doing it as much as she did earlier once she moved back to India. And that was actually, a lot of things changed in her life at that time. She also became a full-time professor and became very distinguished quite quickly.
And she also stopped writing in English. I mean, in English at that point, did she
Yeah,
not?
she
Yeah.
stopped writing in English. And she did that as a political decision. I mean, whenever she was asked about it, she said that was a political choice. And she meant that in a couple of different ways. I mean, of course, a lot of writers in her generation were resisting writing in the language of the colonizers. So that was part of it. But beyond that, she wrote beautifully in English when she lived in America and in London. She wrote absolutely stunning poetry in English, some of which is included in this book. But when she came back, she felt that regional languages and literatures were really at risk. She anticipated, this was in the early 70s, so it was long before actually Indian writing in English took over.
Exploded, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But she anticipated that explosion and she was very excited by it. She thought it was inevitable and it was a great, good thing. But what that meant was that the regional languages and literatures were going to get marginalized, and also, even more importantly, that the identity of Indian literature to the world would become exclusively focused on Indian writing in English as opposed to Indian writing in all the regional languages. And she felt that the only way to make sure that didn't happen was for her to write it in Bangla as an example, and as a kind of as a belief. It was a kind of political, ideological decision that that she hoped that others would kind of start a movement of writing in their mother tongues. Because what happened is that you ended up having people who could, only the people who couldn't write so well in English were writing in the mother tongues. Anybody who could write well in English, like my mother, were writing in English, was writing.
Right.
So that was her.
What a bold statement to make as a poet. Yeah.
Yes, and she
Yeah.
was very particular to, she wrote all her academic work in English, of course.
English, yeah.
Giving papers all over the world.
Right.
She wrote her poetry in exclusively in Bangla once, leaving the earlier body of poetry that she wrote in English aside. And yeah, so that is the choice that she made that coincided with her return to Calcutta.
So speaking of the return to Calcutta, there is a poem that specifically addresses that, and it is Return of the Dead. Would you share that with us, please?
Yes. Return of the Dead. Receive me then, Kolkata. I am your true love, your whole world. I'm back from the war, an aborted mother. I have brought the ocean with me instead. My lap is empty, yes, but my breasts are heavy, overflowing with wasted milk. Look at the fathomless salt water in my eyes. Come then, look at me. See how virginity burns on my brow again, fiery as the setting sun. Touch me, for my newborn flesh belongs to you now. Receive me then, Kolkata, in your waiting arms. Your loneliness is over at last. I have returned just as you had wanted me to. Why this stunned silence then? This anxious glance, this daze? Lift your face. Don't shift your eyes. Look at me. Your prayers were heard. Here I am, returned from the dead. Speak to me. It's your childhood sweetheart, your world of passion, your old flame, your very own Nabaneeta.
There was a period, I believe, in her life where she stopped writing poetry and turned to prose. Is that correct?
That's right, and that coincided with this poem actually. It was a very dark time in her life. She came back with the two of us, two little girls. Her marriage had fallen apart. Her father had died. My poet grandfather had just died. My mother was also extremely close to my other grandfather, my father's father, who also died and who had been very upset about the separation, was very much against it. So she came back feeling very broken. And it was a strange return in a lot of ways, which is what I think this poem is about, because she had left kind of, she had her first book of poetry out, as I said, when she was 21. She had art exhibits that focused on her artwork. She was this, beautiful, clever, brilliant young girl. So she was sort of a very glamorous young person in the world of literature and art and culture in Calcutta when she decided to get married and leave. And then when she came back, and she was also marrying someone who was a star, a young star as well.
Right.
So it was a much talked about, celebrated coupling.
A very public coupling, yeah.
An extremely public coupling. So the decoupling was also with, we didn't have that word at that time.
Right. It was called Scandal, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. So she came back. She had left as an adored darling of the literati, I should say. And then she kind of came back in the shadow of a scandal. And she was not surprised. She was surprised by the awkwardness and coldness with which she was met, because this divorce was a very, very new thing. So no one in her literary or cultural circle knew anybody who had been divorced or who was going to be divorced. So no one quite knew where to place her, how to respond to her. So she decided, and then of course, a lot of very profound and pained poetry came out of that time, which she then felt that the poetry was giving her away. So she had this almost sacred relationship with poetry. She felt that she could never not tell the most stark emotional truth in her poetry.
Well, that's why it resonates as it does. Yeah.
Yes. So as you said, it's so raw, it's so visceral, it's so the proximity is so much that sometimes you want to step back, but it's so it's sort of it's overpowering. So she decided that the only way she didn't want to share so much of herself, but she didn't know how to not do that in poetry. So she continued writing the poetry, but she didn't publish it. She had to keep writing poetry. That was her coping.
It's her lifeline, yeah.
It was her lifeline. So, but she didn't publish it. And the other thing, so that was the emotional reaction. And there was also a resistance to it that she felt as a woman writer, because she felt that as a woman writer in particular, your personal life was scrutinized. Everything from your name, what you wore, every word that you wrote, that it was that judgment was passed on that in a way that male writers didn't have to go through. That the public was not as curious about a male writer's personal life as it was about a woman writer's personal life. So this was a reaction also against that. So what she did, because this was very funny and very actually, this decision really represents what she was all about. The public was getting more and more curious about her personal life because of what they were seeing about it, learning about it through her poetry. So she said, okay, I'm going to stop writing poetry. I'm going to open the doors to my home. I'm going to start writing prose about my family, my messed up family with my mother, my two daughters, in this big rambling house full of books and 17 cats. And this is what I'm going to tell you the truth still. You want the truth? You're going to get the truth. This is the side of me, and it's just as true, and it's mad, and it's hilarious, and it's, and it was so funny, full of self-deprecation. She mercilessly made fun of herself in the same way that she fearlessly allowed herself to cry in her poetry, you see. So she was equally honest in prose as she was in poetry, but it was very, very different. And her prose became her narrative nonfiction, which were all based on truth, like they were autobiographical. They became hugely popular overnight.
Right.
And actually that took time away from her to write poetry, even when she wanted to write poetry, because there was such a big demand for her poetry at the time.
So you had mentioned Make Up Your Mind, which is another absolutely beautiful collection. And I would like to know if you could read Make Up Your Mind.
I would love that. That's it's wonderful to read that right
and
now.
I'm also so grateful that made it in this collection, because that was one of the first poems that I had read of your Ma's, and it was so nice to see it included in Acrobat, which is a book that's obviously going to have a much broader readership.
Well, I'm glad you are happy about that. I am too. I mean, there was a time when it almost didn't make it, just because we already had a book that was called Make Up Your Mind. So, that there was name recognition and all of that. So we wondered about it, but ultimately it made it into it. And I'm really glad that it did. So this is about, in some ways, I mean, you can look at it in so many different ways, this poem, but since we were talking about the two sides of her writerly self, which were both equally true, but different, both true to who she was, both very true to who she was profoundly. And so this poem, the brilliant thing about this poem is that you can interpret it in any number of different ways. But to me, this is about the truth of the two sides of her as an artist. Make up your mind. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me? Within me breathe two people. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me?
So I understand that your grandmother also wrote poetry with two distinct identities. Do you think that came into play with this?
That's such a lovely connection.
Do you believe it came into play with this poem? Or do you think she was writing more about her own experiences?
That is such a brilliant question. She may well have written this poem about my grandmother. Right. So I'll tell you, all about my grandmother, but so my grandmother was an incredible woman. She was a powerhouse. She was married at 12 and widowed at 13, self-educated, and became a best-selling poet. Unbelievably, she was actually. Her poetry was sold more copies than the big novels of her time. Remarried and another poet, and that's how my mother came about. But she wrote two kinds of poetry, and it kind of happened because of a bet that one of the leading male poets made in a literary salon. Said, oh, you women, you only write like Rabindranath Tagore. Of course, we all love Rabindranath Tagore. We grew up with him. Both my books have Rabindranath Tagore covered.
Right.
But that was, my grandmother was very offended by that, because she did not feel that the women poets were trying to follow Rabindranath Tagore. So when she wrote as Radharani Devi, which was her name, the poetry was very strong and very feminist in in what would have been considered as early feminism. So it was kind of inspirational. It would talk about what women needed to do, stand up and find your voice, stop being decorative, don't let the man keep dressing you up in beautiful things. You don't need all of that. What you need.
So it was many steps ahead of actual time.
Yes. So she was doing all of that as Radharani Devi. That was her, that she was already an early feminist poet and that. But when this conversation happened, she said, okay, I'll show you. And she created this different persona of a woman poet called Aparajita Devi. Aparajita means the one who cannot be beaten, invincible. And she but it's also the name of a flower, so it's not such a strange name, girls are
called the superheroes have existed in your family for quite a while.
Sort of. So she, and those poems were about women's desires, about extramarital affairs, about the one that got away, about your childhood crush that you wanted to marry but didn't marry because he wasn't rich enough, about the fight that you have with your sister-in-law, but you also know that you can't live without each other, about the craving for salty, sour things when you're pregnant, So they were a very different, but at the same time, they were impeccable in terms of their form. It was so interesting because you would consider the subject matter to be low. It would have been considered at the time, but written in a form that was the highest of the high. So, so she had a different kind of feminism in that, where she was drawing the world of what was considered feminine, putting it right into the center of the discourse.
Incredible.
That her voice created.
Such bravery.
Yeah.
So speaking of family, one of the poems that really strikes me as one of the strongest about family, and there are many poems about family, it's The Lamp, and I would love for you to share that.
Yeah, I would love that. It's also one of my favorite poems. This is a poem that my mother wrote a few years after my grandmother died, actually, remembering her. Memories on my mother's birthday. Go to sleep now, Ma. It's way past 11. 11? It's still early then. But you must go to bed. You're teaching tomorrow. Ma sits in her easy chair, thick glasses perched on her thin nose, pale fingers clutching her magnifying glass, the statesman spread out across her lap. Next to her on the table, her flask of tea, her medicines, her fragrant beetle leaf in its silver case, her brass spittoon, her cash box. Behind her, on the teapoy, an earthen vase filled with her favorite white tuberoses, and a wicker table lamp weaved in agartala. Before her, the alarm clock ticking away, her traveling timepiece. As Ma turns the pages of the newspaper, its noisy crackle splinters the quiet night. Closing my book, I come to her. As soon as I step inside, I drown in the deep perfume of those tuberoses. The nurse is dozing in her chair. Ma, please go to sleep now. It's 1:30. 1:30? She scolds. And you're still awake? Don't you have college tomorrow? Swallowing the rebuke, I keep on wheedling. You'll get sick, Ma, if you stay up like this. You must take care of your body. My body? Ma breaks into a laughter that sparkles, like jewelry shimmering from head to toe. How much more sick can it get? And what use is my body, anyway? I go to her one more time before I sleep. It's 2:30, Ma. Do call it a night. Come, let me take you to your bed. Yes, I'm coming. There's just only this one tiny bit left. Reading isn't so easy now, you see. It's the gift of these cataracts. With a slight smile, embarrassed, apologetic, she buries herself again in printed words. Under the glowing light of the table lamp, with her focus on the magnifying glass, the ticking of the alarm clock fades away. As I walk back to my room, I hear her speaking softly to the nurse. No, no, my dear, don't turn off the light. Keep that lamp switched on, please. I have just one more page left. Just one more page left. One more paragraph. One more sentence. Give me one more word, dear nurse. Just one more day.
It's incredible. I think for any devoted reader, there's always just one more page left. It's just incredible. So I'm just in the interest of time, I'm thinking maybe we could jump to a few questions. We have some questions.
Well, no, hold on. Let's a second. I'm sorry. I want to answer all questions, but first we are talking about this poem is about the love of words and passion for reading, and also the need for words, the transformative power of words. And what I love about your book, I Go Quiet, is that it is also about that. It's very much about that. And together, these two books, if I Go Quiet is about about finding your own voice in a too loud world, I Get Loud is about amplifying that voice through friendship and through solidarity. And they are such a beautiful combination of books together about identity, about words, about voice. So I'm afraid I cannot let you go unless you read a bit from I Go Quiet.
All right. Okay. And then we'll get to the questions. Sometimes when I go quiet, I read. When I read, I know there are languages that I will speak. When I read, I know that there's a world beneath my branches. When I read, I feel that every living thing is part of me. I think I may be part of everything too. I'm not so different, and I am not small. I will build cities with my words. They will not be quiet. Yes, sometimes I go quiet, but someday I will make a shimmering noise.
Yes. I just wanted to show the beautiful, stunning artwork that you have in this. You know, you were talking about how much of a creative force my mother was, but you, my friend, are just like her and incredibly talented painter.
I can hardly be compared to your mother, but it's very kind.
But you're a very different kind of an artist, but you are equally multi-talented. You paint, you write, you do films, you sing, you compose songs, there are some people like you and my mother who are just so unfairly uber talented, and the rest of us just kind of have to muddle along.
As an actress, as a writer, we'll go on. Let's get to our questions. So Nandana and David, both of you work creatively across numerous mediums. How do you divide your time across so many of your pursuits? How do you structure your creative lives and let all of your impulses breathe, but also keep your projects on track? I'm sorry. Nandana?
Well, I'm trying to look at this question. Am I able to see that or not? Am I finding?
I think if you hit the Q&A, you should be able to get it, unless it's just available to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it now. The truth is I don't keep all my projects on track. I'm not really very good about time management. So when I was doing this book, I was in fact supposed to be I was already committed to doing 2 other books for Penguin. two children's books. One is a sequel to a book called Mambi and the Forest Fire, and the other is another book which I was supposed to have done. Instead of which I worked on Acrobat because I felt that is what I needed to do. There wasn't any other book that I could focus on. So I'm not very, there are people who do a number of things at the same time. Actually, David will have a different answer because he does, and he does it brilliantly. Whereas I kind of have, I work at one project at a time in terms of, the writing work. But I also do a lot of work with children in child rights. So there's a lot of work that I do, a great deal of collaboration that I do, for instance, with Save the Children, which is a very different world to be engaging with than the literary world of translation. And so there are things like that kind of happen at the same time. There's the screenwriting happen. I mean, there are ways in which they kind of intersection, but there's always ever one major project as a writer in my life.
It's interesting that we began our chat speaking about the poem Acrobat because it is about balancing. And I think that really is what it comes down to, is balancing. And not getting a lot of sleep when you get to certain stages in certain projects, sure.
Sure, it's
true. The next question, it's a beautiful question. I would really love to hear more about your approach to translating Bengali to English. Your mention of choosing to change the genderless third person pronoun to she is a great example of the nuances I'm curious about. Have you translated in other languages besides Bengali? When you read or hear other people's translations of Bengali, do you hear things you try to avoid or emulate as a translator?
That is an excellent question. Why are these all anonymous, incidentally? Why are you putting your questions anonymously? They're such brilliant questions.
They're brilliant, huh?
So Bengali has a lot, Bengali has its challenges, and the way my mother wrote her poetry had its challenges. That choice of choosing she rather than he, there are many more decisions like that one has to make when structurally. It's interesting because in some ways Bengali gives you many more options than English would in terms of choices that you can make. But in other ways, such as in this particular case of the third person pronoun, it doesn't, right? So it's the same word for a girl or a boy or an animal or an inanimate object. So it was, I think what I did is to choose what seemed most right and what I felt. This is, I mean, different people feel differently about it. And maybe I took some liberties because it was my mother's poetry that I was translating. So I took the liberty of thinking, well, I'll make a guess about what she would have wanted to say in this. And therefore, that's what I'm going to say. Now, would I have taken that approach if I was translating someone else's poetry? I'm not sure. Have I translated from any other language? I have not. I could possibly translate from Hindi. I know that quite well, but I don't. The only language that I have as much confidence, so as I have, there isn't any other language that I feel as confident about as I feel about Bangla. And then yes, the second part of your question, when you read or hear other people's translations of Bengali, do you try to? Yes, I do, because a lot of times they are very accurate translations, but they can become very wordy because Bengali, there's a kind of contradiction here. Bengali can say a lot in a few words, but those words can be quite wordy, if you know what I mean. They're all like mouthfuls and they're difficult words. So so there is that you always have to kind of navigate that between those seeming contradictions of structural contradictions of the language. So a lot of times the translations I found were quite wordy. They're using words that are literally correct, but not really fitting the flow or the mood of the piece. Or sometimes they're fine, but they're not ambitious enough. They just, they're okay. They meet the bar, but they don't really exceed it. It's changing a lot now. I think finally translation is getting a lot more attention in India. Still not as much as it should. My mother wrote extensively about her frustrations about that, the fact that there were not enough translations, and the translations were not good enough, and the translations that were good enough were not available. So those were the three discontents of translation that she spoke about extensively. So I think it's there are peculiar challenges to every language, and with Bengali it is another thing that my mother did that I mentioned earlier, that is easier to do in Bangla and much harder to do in English, is to make up words. You can join two words and make up a new word that you immediately understand. And because we also make consonants like that, we join two consonants and make consonants. We have this literary and linguistic tradition of joining letters and phonemes and words, which doesn't really exist in English. So creating new words becomes really hard. So how do you parse them? How do you convey the same sense of a united word without being able to do that? So anyway, excellent question. I'm not sure that I answered it, but
I think it was a beautiful, beautiful question and a beautiful answer. Question for Nandana. What was it like translating your mother's work as opposed to other works you've translated? Like David mentioned, were you able to step back, or did you feel that your background with your mother's voice amplified the intensity of the project in a productive way?
Another excellent question. I have translated some other work. I've translated some of Tagore's work. I've translated work that I've been asked to translate, but mostly I've translated my mother. I've translated Tagore because there were some favorite poems of songs of mine that I felt had not been translated, and I had to give a talk about translating songs and translating poetry. So I ended up, I couldn't find examples, so I translated for that NYU class. So they've all been need-based. I've not had a translation project except for with my mother, but I think I was. You never really know, right? If you are able to step back, somebody else may be able to answer that question better. I tried to, and I think I did. And my husband John actually helped me with it a lot, because I would ask him, I would completely confound him and annoy him by asking absurdly detailed questions about one syllable, whether this particular syllable sounded like that, or whether my translation was one syllable too long. My mother was absolutely like that. She kind of agonized over every word and every syllable, every scansion, and I'm like that too. So I think I did try to step back, but I don't know that I can tell with full confidence that I do feel that my mother's voice amplified the intensity of the project in a productive way. I do think that's really true. And I think whether it's just, because to answer that literally, every time, one of the things that made it hard for me to do the translations was that every time I was translating a poem, I could literally hear her voice reading that poem, which was beautiful, but also heartbreaking, because I lost her very recently, and I was grieving. And so it made it really hard, but it was very present. So her voice was, in a literal way, very present throughout this process. But her voice in the sense of what she was like, what she represented, what what was important to her, the values that she had as a woman and as an artist, all those things that go into your voice. Of course, that helped. The fact that I felt I was very close to that helped me in terms of making some choices, taking some risks, feeling confident that I was able to be true to it, even if I wasn't being literal. Does that answer your question?
So we have two very brave souls who have given their names.
Oh, wonderful.
So let's go to Jennifer. And she asks, Nandana would love to hear you talk about your observations of Bengali literary culture in comparison to American literary culture.
You know, how much time do we have? There's a lot to say. You know, so the short version of that is, since we're talking about poetry, I have to say that Bengali culture has a particular love of poetry in a way that, I mean, we all love poetry. Everyone who loves books and literature likes poetry. But Bengali culture deifies poets in a way that I have not seen other cultures do. So my husband often talks about this story when he was and he was a publisher years ago, and he was in the Kolkata Book Fair, and he saw that there was this enormous winding line going around and around, and people were standing there for hours. He was just going into his stall and coming out and doing everything, but this line was not moving. It was only getting longer. And he said, what's going on? Who is it? Is there some, is the chief minister coming, or is a movie star coming? And the person that he asked the question to looked at him with disgust and said, no, of course not. They're all waiting to see a poet, of course. And I think it might have been Shankar Ghosh, who was an amazing poet, Bengali poet who died fairly recently. He was a bit older than my mother, but they were very close, and he was a mentor to my mother as well. And I believe he was the poet that everybody was queuing up for. So there's a kind of love that is, there's a very, very gentle lionization of poets in Bengali culture, which I haven't seen anywhere else. There are other things that make it unique, like we have a singular literary figure that has affected in some way or the other all of Bengali literature, and that is Rabindranath Tagore. Now, you may follow him, you may reject him, you may deny that you've been influenced by him, but there's no way you have grown up in Bengali culture without being steeped in his poetry, in his songs that you hear all around you. The Bengali dancing form is devised by him. And then also there was his art that surrounded us as well. So
beautiful, yeah.
It's unique that there's one literary figure that is so prominent and sort of such a forefather in every way of the Bengali literary culture.
We're going to go back to an anonymous question. I'm curious what you observed of your mother's evolution into a public figure through her writing. Did she ever get pushback from more conservative forces? Did you ever feel that her stature also impacted her security? What was her lifeline relationship to the literati, as you mentioned? Did her uniqueness make it difficult for her to feel she had a genuine community?
I think it really did initially. I think that's what that poem you asked me to read was expressing. I think she felt that her uniqueness, both as a poet, both as a writer, because she also wrote, we're only talking about her poetry, but she actually wrote in every genre imaginable. She wrote for children, she wrote novels, she wrote plays, she wrote journalism, she wrote travelogues, of course, many books of academic writing. So she was unique in that way. Nobody could really slot her as a certain kind of writer. She was also unique in the sense that she wrote for every age, and she had a huge following in every age. And she was really brave in everything that she wrote and said. There was no subterfuge about anything that she wrote, whether it was the one thing that was, even though her tone and style was very different in poetry, the poetry was heart-wrenching and the fiction was often laugh out loud funny. But she just had no time for circumvention or subterfuge. She was just always very direct and honest about whatever she was feeling and whatever she was writing about. So that was difficult. I think people found that disturbing, especially in a woman. I think she observed correctly that there was a gentleness that was expected of her that she did not provide and did not try to provide. So, and then talking about the pushback from more conservative forces, I'm not sure if you're talking about conservative in a artistic literary way or conservative in a political way. The artistic community, I have to say, is, it is quite, I think she put everything kind of off kilter for a while, but then her voice became clear, and the love that she had from her readers was so strong that she found her place, and there was no one else who was like her, right? So people recognized her uniqueness, and actually it was celebrated as she was really celebrated as someone who was an incredible force and brought so much to and kind of was so impactful, so influential to the world of Bengali culture, and she was really loved and respected for that. In terms of her political views, which were very strong, and she brought that into her poetry, she brought that into her novels, she brought that into her journalism. Yes, she got a lot of pushback from more conservative forces. She was definitely seen as a troublemaker. But, she was a kind of activist in her writing. She was a language activist in terms of the way she insisted on writing in Bengali. And there were a lot of, she wrote very strongly about how much of a disservice we were doing to ourselves by allowing English literature and writing to be representing all of Indian literature. So here there was a culture of a literary tradition in a country which had existed for thousands of years, actually, and suddenly when understandably the world's perception of Indian literature was limited to only those books that were written in English, which she loved. She had nothing against that. She embraced them, and she thought that was also, of course, Indian literature, but that was not the only representation of Indian literature. So she wrote a lot about that, and some people were happy about her position, some people were not. So, but the important thing there is that she did not, she did not actually, I think she did feel she had belonged to a genuine community because the community adored her. They did not necessarily think that she was, someone that you could easily describe or, slot. But they really, really adored her. So it was, and she was also a mentor. She was a great teacher. She loved teaching. She loved bringing young people together. She started a women's association, an association for women writers, which gave them a lot of strength and identity, and is still continuing. She began that, and she was a big inspiration. So I think she did believe that she belonged to a genuine community.
And I also think it's important to note that there are 200 million speakers of Bengali throughout the world. So it's a massive community that she touched in her. And I really I hope this book brings her English readership to a level that she deserves. So we have one more question from Patrick, and it is, what did your mother think about the need to teach native languages in India and beyond?
That's another excellent question, Patrick. Thank you so much. She thought it was extremely important. And she was very worried that the younger generation, especially in the cities, were losing touch with their mother tongues. I had the joy, for instance, to give you an example, I went to an English medium school, a very middle class English medium school called South Point. It was a very posh school. And you had the choice, everybody had to choose a first language, a second language, and a third language. All of my friends had English as their first language, Bengali as their second language. We were all Bengali speaking. And some of us had Hindi as a third language and Sanskrit as a third language. I made the choice of having Bengali as my first language, which my mother supported. She didn't push me into that. It was totally up to me, but that's the choice I made. And English was my second language and Sanskrit was my third language. And I'm so glad that I did that, because that equipped me to read all of Bengali literature, not all of Bengali literature, but the classics of Bengali literature voraciously. By the time I was sort of in my mid-teens, I had read most of the books that and I think that's the only time in my life where I was reading as much in Bengali as I was reading in English, and I was reading so much. I mean, I can't, when I think about how much I was able to read then, it blows my mind. I've never had another period in my life when I did that. So yeah, I think she did feel that Bengali was regional languages were under threat, not only because of Indian writing in English, but also because more and more there was a kind of predominance of popular culture in Hindi, like the film music, Bollywood, film, television was in Hindi. So you were hearing Hindi more than Bengali. And even children who were growing up in a Bengali speaking city like Kolkata were speaking Bengali as if it was with an accent, like someone who had learned the language. So all of those things she felt very disturbed by, because of course she believed that it was the young generation who would keep the language together, and if they lose their connection to the language, then it would disintegrate.
And she's so right about that. Yeah.
Yes.
So I would love it if we could close our evening with one last poem, which is a poem, Catch of the Day. And I think it's a poem of really great playfulness, but more importantly, it has this like kind of innate curiosity of it. And I think that it's very fitting because that really reflects the presence of your mother that she possessed in the room and her character. And I think it's a beautiful way to end this evening.
I'd love to. Catch of the Day. I want to chop it up, slice it into pieces, grind it into a paste, season it, then shut it in the oven. They didn't win. The sun, the rain, the earth. It's still all raw inside, floundering like a catfish, still alive, freshly caught. My youth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. This was an absolutely fascinating event. I personally, I was just riveted learning about your mother, Nandana. About her artistry and also her iconoclasm. I'm so glad that you were both able to share her work and details about her life with our audience. And I want to thank our audience for being with us tonight and for asking such wonderful questions. David, thank you for guiding the yeah, David as well.
I've done a few of them now, and usually the questions are, this was
it's outstanding.
Yeah. Outstanding questions, yes.
Thank you so much to you both. This was absolutely wonderful. And I just want to let our audience know this event will be on our YouTube channel in a few days. So if you want to, touch back or relive any of this, you'll be able to access it there. But for now, I'd like to say good night to you all and good night to Nandana and David. Thank you so much to the both of you.
Thank you so
Very
much,
welcome. It's our
Bill.
pleasure.
David, it's always so much fun to chat.
It is. It
I'm
is.
so glad you did this. Thank you so much to both of you. And thank you to all our friends who are here. And thank you for all your amazing questions and observations. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. All right. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Okay.